mother of his children on June 16th, 2025. Police were called. He was arrested. The prosecutors stood before a judge and said that this man should not go home. They said he had tried to kill her. They said the evidence was right there in front of them, in the bruising on her neck, in the fear in her voice, in the documented record of a lethality assessment that the police had completed that same night and that had come back with one clear, unambiguous result: great danger. The court heard all of it, and then the court sent him home with an ankle bracelet on his leg. 19 days later, Sharita Cristwell was dead. She was 29 years old. She was a mother. She had two daughters who called her mama. She had dreams of owning a home big enough for her girls and her mother to all live under one roof. Antoine, she had a gift for makeup artistry that she had turned into work, into identity, into something that was hers. She had a whole life that was supposed to keep going, and the system that was given every tool it needed to protect her: a lethality assessment, a felony charge, a prosecutor's explicit request for detention, looked at all of that and decided that an ankle monitor was enough. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough. And what happened in Prince George's County, Maryland, in the summer of 2025 is not just the story of one woman's death. It is the story of every mechanism that exists to protect Black women from the men who want to destroy them. And what happens when those mechanisms bend under the weight of institutional indifference. If you are not subscribed to Behind the Evidence, do it right now. One, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell these stories because they need to be told, because the women in them deserve more than a headline and a candle, and because the communities that lose them deserve to understand exactly how and why it happened. No, wait, let us get into it. Sharita Cristwell grew up in the Washington, D.C. metro area, rooted in the kind of close-knit Black family where the mother is the center of everything, where Sunday visits are mandatory, where showing up for each other is not a suggestion but a language. Her adopted mother, Joyce Cristwell, described her as that everything with daughter, the one who came by for manicures and restaurant runs and doctor's appointments, the one who showed up with a smile and turned ordinary days into something worth remembering. Her sister Kim knew her as the baby of the family, the one who made rooms lighter just by walking into them. Her biological mother, Jerice McCotter, loved her in the specific, irreplaceable way that mothers love the child. They watched transform from infant to woman, from daughter to mother herself. Sharita had two daughters, Harmony and Layla. They were 9 and 10 years old when their mother was killed, born only a day apart in different years. Two little girls who shared their birthdays like they shared everything else, in the orbit of a mother who poured herself into them. Sharita had dreams for her daughters the way mothers do, the kind of dreams that are ordinary and enormous at the same time. She wanted a bigger home, enough rooms for everyone. She and Joyce had talked about it, a 4-bedroom house where the family could live together, where there was space and stability and the security that comes from having your people close. It was not an extravagant dream. It was a mother's dream, the most basic and humane. She was also building something for herself. Her work as a makeup artist was not a side hustle or a hobby. She had committed to it. It was craft. It was identity. In the way that creative work becomes a part of how a person understands themselves, her artistry was woven into who she was. She was known for it by the people who knew her, recognized for a talent that she had developed and owned. She was 29 years old with her whole professional life still ahead of her, with the kind of skill set that grows deeper and more refined with time. She had time. That is what everyone who loved her believed. She had so much time. Harry Dominique Lindsey was 32 years old, 3 years older than Sharita, and he had been in her life for approximately 10 years, according to her family. A decade. That is not a casual relationship. That is not something that can be fully understood from the outside by anyone who has not lived inside it, who has not experienced the particular weight of a decade of shared history, shared children, shared arguments, shared reconciliations, shared everything. 10 years is long enough that a person becomes woven into the fabric of your daily existence in ways that are genuinely difficult to disentangle. Long enough that the line between love and habit and fear becomes blurry in ways that researchers who study intimate partner dynamics understand, and that people outside those dynamics often do not. Sharita and Harry had two daughters together. Those daughters were the most visible, a most permanent bond between them, and like every co-parenting situation that emerges from a relationship that has run its course, the children created ongoing points of contact, ongoing reasons to communicate, ongoing negotiations that kept Harry Lindsey in Sharita Cristwell's life, even after she had decided that the relationship, the romantic relationship, the intimate partnership was over. She had moved on. She had started seeing someone new. She had found, as her sister Kim would later say through tears at a press conference, what real love was. She was trying to build something different, something healthier, something that did not carry the weight that a decade with Harry Lindsey had accumulated. Lindsey found out. The way he found out and what he did with that information each tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he was and the psychology driving everything that followed. Before the assault on June 16th, before the strangulation that would generate a police report and an arrest and a lethality assessment and a court appearance, and ultimately a release that would cost Sharita her life, there was a moment that has not received enough attention in the public discussion of this case. Lindsey took a video. He filmed Sharita's car parked outside the home of the man she was seeing. He sent that video to her, and with it came a threat. He told her he was going to kill them both. Let that sit for a moment. He did not confront her in anger in the heat of the moment. He surveilled her. He followed her, or tracked her, or waited and watched until he knew where she was and who she was with and where her car was parked. He documented it. He recorded it on his phone. And then he used it as a weapon, as a message, as a declaration of intent wrapped in the language of a threat. This is not impulsive behavior. This is controlled, deliberate, targeted intimidation. This is a man who is communicating to a woman that she is being watched, that her movements are known, that the idea of her existing in the world without him is something he has already decided he will not accept. The surveillance and the threat were the opening statement. What happened on June 16, 2025, was the next sentence in the same paragraph. Lindsey attacked Sharita, he beat her, and then he put his hands around her neck and strangled her. Not pushed her, not grabbed her by the shirt. He strangled her, which is among the most intimate and the most lethal forms of physical violence, because it requires sustained physical proximity, requires a sustained decision to maintain pressure while looking at the person you are choking, and requires a level of intent that cannot be disguised as accidental or reflexive. You cannot accidentally strangle someone. You cannot strangle someone without knowing exactly what you are doing and continuing to do it anyway. In Maryland, strangulation was elevated to a felony offense in 2020. That legislative change was specifically designed to address the documented, research-backed reality that strangulation in a domestic violence context is one of the strongest predictors of future homicide. The research on this is not ambiguous. Studies have shown consistently that a woman who has been strangled by an intimate partner is 7 times more likely to be killed by that partner than a woman who has experienced other forms of domestic violence. 7 times. Not marginally more likely, not slightly elevated, 7 times more likely to end up dead. That statistic is why advocates push for the felony classification. It is why Prince George's County Executive Aisha Braveboy, a former state's attorney who had spent her career in the criminal justice system, had specifically championed the law 5 years earlier. She understood what strangulation meant in the context of domestic violence. She understood that when a man puts his hands around a woman's throat, he is not expressing frustration. He is rehearsing murder. When Sharita Cristwell called the police on June 16th to 2025 and reported that Harry Lindsey had beaten and strangled her, she activated a system that was, in theory, equipped to respond to exactly this situation. The police came. They took the report. They arrested Lindsey and charged him with first and second-degree assault. And critically, they completed a domestic violence lethality assessment. This is a formal, structured tool used by law enforcement to evaluate the risk level of a domestic violence situation based on documented factors that research has identified as predictors of lethal violence. It is not a subjective gut check. It is a standardized instrument built from decades of data, designed specifically to translate the warning signs present in a given case into a risk classification that the judicial system can act on. And the assessment in Sharita Cristwell's case came back classified as greater danger. The strangulation was a primary factor. The prior surveillance and death threat were factors. The pattern of the relationship was a factor. The system looked at Sharita Cristwell's situation through a formal analytical lens and said, in the clearest possible institutional language, that this woman is at elevated risk of being killed by this man. Then the prosecutors took that assessment and the charge and walked into court and made the argument that any reasonable reading of that evidence demanded. They argued that Harry Lindsey should be held without bond, that a man who had strangled a woman, who had previously threatened to kill her and the man she was seeing, who had a documented surveillance pattern, should not be walking around free while the case worked its way through the court system. They were explicit about the danger. They cited the lethality assessment. They cited the research on strangulation. They made the case that every tool available to the prosecution was pointing in the same direction, that releasing this man created a credible, documented, formally assessed risk to Sharita Cristwell's life. The judge released him anyway. Not on his own recognizance, not with any conditions. A judge looked at the prosecution's argument, looked at the lethality assessment classified ager great danger, looked at the felony assault charge, looked at the prior threat to kill, and concluded that home detention with an electronic monitoring ankle bracelet was the appropriate response. Harry Lindsey went home. He went home with a device on his leg that could tell authorities where he was, a device that could not stop him from picking up a weapon, a device that is, in its fundamental nature, a tracking tool and not a protection tool. It tells you where a person has been. It does not prevent them from being anywhere. This is the gap at the center of Sharita Cristwell's story. Not a paperwork failure, not a missed report or an unfiled document. The paperwork was done, the report was filed, the assessment was completed and classified correctly. The prosecutors made the right argument. Every piece of the institutional machinery that is supposed to protect women like Sharita functioned as designed, right up until the moment it was supposed to produce the outcome that all of that machinery exists to produce, which is keeping a dangerous man away from the woman he has already proven he will harm. And at that moment, the moment that mattered most, a judge made a decision that contradicted what the system's own risk assessment said, and Sharita Cristwell was left exposed. After the release, Harry Lindsey called Sharita's mother. Grace McCotter picked up the phone and heard the man who had just been arrested for strangling her daughter tell her he was sorry, that he loved her daughter, that he would never do it again. McCotter told the media exactly what she said back to him, and then she told the world what happened 4 days after that phone call. He killed my baby. Those 4 words, delivered by a mother at a press conference with grief written into every line of her face, are the summary of everything that went wrong in this case. Was the apology, the promise, the release, the murder? 4 days. That is what the gap between the lethality assessment and the judicial decision costs. 4 days in a woman's life. Prince George's County, Maryland, is not a random backdrop for this story. It is one of the wealthiest majority Black counties in the United States, a county that has been held up as a symbol of Black economic and political progress, a place where Black professional life, Black family life, Black community life has flourished in ways that are genuinely meaningful and genuinely hard-won. It is also a county that has long struggled with domestic violence, that averages approximately 2,000 protective and peace orders per month, and that has seen the same pattern of under-response and institutional failure that affects domestic violence cases in Black communities across the country play out repeatedly within its borders. The contradiction between the county's image and its domestic violence reality is not a coincidence. It is a reflection of the broader reality that economic and political progress does not automatically translate into safety for Black women inside their own homes, inside their own relationships, from the men they have chosen to trust. The community that surrounded Sharita Cristwell and her family responded to her death with the specific urgent grief of people who recognize the pattern. One, a GoFundMe organized in her memory raised money for funeral costs and for the long-term care of Harmony and Layla. Community members wrote about how her death struck a nerve, about how Prince George's County had failed her, about how the law does not take domestic violence seriously until it ends in a fatality. These were not abstract political statements. They were the testimonies of people who had watched this happen before, who had seen the warning signs ignored, who had lived close enough to the reality of domestic violence in their community to know that Sharita Cristwell was not the first and would not be the last. That knowledge, the exhausted, furious knowledge of a community that has been watching this pattern repeat, is one of the most important dimensions of this case, and one of the most important things to understand about who Sharita Cristwell was and what her death meant to the people who knew her and to the people who recognized themselves and the women they loved in her story. Aisha Braveboy stood at a press conference 4 days after Sharita's death and said something that every person who heard it needed to hear. She said the homicide should never have happened. She said the individual who strangled Sharita, who they believed intended to kill her through that strangulation, should have been held without bond. She acknowledged that she could not explain why the decision was made to release Lindsey on home monitoring. She said it should not have happened, and she said the words that Braveboy has been saying in various forms for years, or the words that reflect the research consensus that the Maryland felony strangulation law was specifically designed to codify into legal consequence. Anyone who strangles you intends to kill you. Make no mistake. Those words land differently when the woman they were meant to protect is already dead. Braveboy knew that. The community knew that. The Cristwell family, standing at that press conference with tears and shaking voices, knew that. What should have been a warning delivered in time to save a life became instead a eulogy delivered over the grave of a woman who was failed by the very system that was supposed to know better. But Braveboy's words also do something else. They create a record. They put on the formal, public, documented record of Prince George's County government an admission that the system failed, that the decision that was made contradicted what the evidence required, and that a woman died because a judge made a call that the prosecution's own lethality assessment said was wrong. That record matters, not just for Sharita's case, not just for the legal proceedings against Harry Lindsey that are still working through the courts, but for the conversation that this case demands about how domestic violence is handled in Black communities, about the specific vulnerability of Black women in the American judicial system, and about what it means when every tool says high danger and nothing changes. Because here is the thing about Harry Lindsey that makes this case even more chilling than the bare facts already suggest. After Sharita was dead, after he had been arrested and charged with her murder, after he was sitting in custody without bond waiting for a trial that would determine the rest of his life, he gave an interview to the Washington Post. And in that interview, he acknowledged killing Sharita Cristwell. He said he acted in self-defense. He denied that the relationship had ended. He denied the abuse allegations against him. He sat in custody, charged with the murder of the mother of his children, and his account of events was that he was the one protecting himself. That Sharita Cristwell, 29 years old, a makeup artist, a mother, a woman whose neck bore the evidence of his hands, was somehow a threat that required a gun. That claim, self-defense, tells you everything about how Harry Lindsey understood the relationship, understood the violence, understood his own role in what had happened to Sharita. It is the same psychology that shows up in domestic violence perpetrators again and again. The reframing of control as protection, of aggression as response, of the victim's attempt to live her own life as a provocation that the perpetrator was entitled to meet with force. It is the same logic that said her car being parked outside another man's house was an offense serious enough to warrant a death threat. It is the same logic that said the strangulation on June 16th was something other than what the lethality assessment correctly classified it as. It is the logic of a man who has organized his entire understanding of a relationship around his own centrality, his own authority, his own right to determine what Sharita Cristwell was allowed to do and who she was allowed to be. The ankle monitor was on his leg when he killed her. That detail has not been repeated enough. He was under court supervision. He was being electronically tracked as a condition of his release. The device that was supposed to represent the court's ongoing oversight of his behavior, the technological substitute for incarceration that a judge had decided was adequate protection for a woman whose life had been formally assessed as being at high risk, was strapped to his ankle while he pulled out a gun in an apartment in Landover on the afternoon of July 5, 2025, while her daughters were somewhere in the world growing up without knowing that their mother would not come home that day. 2 daughters. Harmony and Layla Lindsey. They turned 9 and 10 years old after their mother was gone, their birthdays only a day apart, was celebrated at a skating rink while their grandmothers fought over who would raise them. Joyce Cristwell, Sharita's adopted mother, recently secured a 4-bedroom home, the very thing Sharita had dreamed of, and is now hoping a judge will grant her at least partial custody of those girls. The house that was supposed to hold a mother and her daughters and her mother will now hold a grandmother and her granddaughters in the permanent absence of the woman who dreamed it into being. That is what the judicial decision of June 2025 produced. Not just a death, a family reshaped by loss around the hole where a mother used to be. Prince George's County recorded at least 15 domestic-related homicides in 2025. 15. Sharita Cristwell was one of them. She was not a statistic when she was alive, and she should not become one in the telling of her death. She was the baby of her family. She was the woman who showed up to her mother's house with a smile. She was the makeup artist who had turned her gift into her work. She was the mother of Harmony and Layla, who dreamed of a big house with enough rooms for everyone she loved. She was a woman 10 years into a relationship that had shown her, in increasing and ultimately fatal clarity, that the man she had built those years with was not going to let her leave without consequences, and who had done what she was supposed to do, who had called the police, who had cooperated with the lethality assessment, who had relied on the system to do what it said it would do, which was keep her safe. The system knew she was in danger. The assessment said so. The prosecutor said so. And the strangulation said so. The surveillance and the death threat said so. The 10-year pattern of a relationship that had been building toward this said so. Everything said so. And the one person in the room who had the authority to act on all of it in the way that it required made a decision that sent a dangerous man home. And 4 days later, Sharita Cristwell was shot twice and killed in an apartment in Landover while her ankle-monitored killer stood over her and then fled into the July afternoon. She tried to get away. Her sister Kim said that at the press conference, through tears, as a fact that needed to be spoken out loud. She did try to get away. She had moved on. She had started a new relationship. She had carried 10 years of history with Harry Lindsey and decided that her future would look different, and that her daughters deserved a free mother, that she deserved to know what it felt like to be loved without fear underneath it. She had gotten there. She had found it. And the system that was supposed to hold the line between her new life and the man who wanted to destroy it put an ankle bracelet on his leg and called it protection. What comes next in this story is the moment of July 5th, the apartment in Landover, the argument that ended with 2 gunshots and a man running, and a woman pronounced dead at the scene, while her daughters existed somewhere in the world not yet knowing what had just happened to them. It is the manhunt that followed, the surveillance footage, the arrest in Capitol Heights. It is the community's response, the balloon release planned by Kim, the GoFundMe, and the press conference where a county executive stood in front of cameras and said this should never have happened and could not explain why it did. And it is the larger conversation this case demands about strangulation as a felony, about lethality assessments that classify danger correctly and get ignored anyway, about Black women and what the American justice system decides their safety is worth when the paperwork is all in order and the outcome is still a body. Sharita Cristwell deserved to live. She deserved the house she dreamed about. She deserved to watch Harmony and Layla grow up. She deserved to grow old in the warmth of a family that loved her with everything they had. And every institution that touched this case before July 5th, 2025, every officer who filed a report, every prosecutor who made an argument, every piece of paper that segregates danger in capital letters, did their part right up until the moment that mattered most. And at that moment, the moment when a judge had the power to make the warning mean something, the system chose an ankle bracelet over a woman's life. It was the 4th of July weekend. In neighborhoods across Prince George's County, families were gathering, grills were lighting, and children were out in the summer heat, running between yards and driveways with the particular freedom that holiday weekends give. It was a Saturday afternoon, 3:35 in the afternoon, the kind of summer hour when the day is fully open, when darkness is still hours away, when the idea of violence feels like something that belongs to the night, rather than the bright, ordinary middle of a summer day. At 3:35 p.m. on July 5, 2025, a call came into Prince George's County Dispatch reporting a shooting inside an apartment in the 700 block of the Stretford Way in Landover. Officers arrived and found Sharita Cristwell. She had been shot twice. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The man who had been under court supervision for strangling her 19 days earlier was gone. Harry Lindsey had fled before the first officer walked through the door. The word argument appears in every official account of what happened that afternoon. Police say Lindsey shot Cristwell during an argument. That word argument does a lot of work in the language of law enforcement reports. It creates an impression of mutuality, of two people in a heated exchange that escalated. It does not capture what a decade of documented coercive behavior, a prior strangulation, a death threat, a lethality assessment rated great danger, and a man who had been told by a court to stay home actually looks like when it reaches its final moment. What happened in that apartment on Stretford Way was not an argument between equals that went wrong. It was the conclusion of a pattern that had been building for years, the final expression of a man who had surveilled Sharita, threatened her, beaten her, strangled her, told her mother he was sorry, received his release on home detention, and then crossed whatever remaining boundary he had been pretending to respect. He acknowledged killing her. In an interview with the Washington Post, Harry Lindsey confirmed that he was the one who shot Sharita Cristwell. He said he acted in self-defense. He denied that the relationship had ended. He denied the abuse allegations. He sat in custody. I charged with her murder, or in his account was that the 29-year-old makeup artist, the mother of his two daughters, a woman who had a documented lethality assessment classifying her situation as great danger, was somehow a threat that required him to use a firearm. That claim, self-defense, is the same psychological architecture that generated the surveillance video, that generated the death threat, that generated the strangulation on June 16th. It is the logic of a man who cannot locate himself as the cause of anything. In his construction of events, he was always responding, always reacting, always the one who was wronged first. Sharita being alive and moving on with her life was, in his worldview, something being done to him. Her existing without him was an aggression that demanded a response. The ankle monitor was on his leg at the moment he pulled out that gun. That fact matters beyond its symbolic weight. It means that the device the court had substituted for incarceration, the technological compromise that stood in for the detention the prosecution had explicitly requested, was present and recording as Harry Lindsey ended Sharita Cristwell's life. The system knew exactly where he was. It knew he was in that apartment. It knew the moment the shooting occurred, what it could not do, what no ankle monitor can do, what an ankle monitor has never been designed to do, is prevent the violence from happening. It is a witness, not a wall. It records the location of a person. It does not stop that person from having a weapon. It does not stop that person from making the decision to use it. It is evidence after the fact, not protection in the moment. And in the moment that mattered, the moment that the lethality assessment had specifically flagged as the kind of moment the system was designed to prevent, the ankle monitor was exactly as useful as it sounds. It blinked and recorded and did nothing else. After the shooting, Lindsey ran. He left the apartment, left Sharita's body, left the gun, in the afternoon and the 4th of July weekend, continuing around him as though nothing had happened, and he tried to put distance between himself and what he had done. This too is consistent with the psychology and the behavioral pattern of someone who has been operating from a position of entitlement, who believed, based on prior experience with a system that had released him less than 3 weeks ago after strangling a woman, that there was still a path out, and that he could move fast enough, disappear effectively enough, that the consequences might not catch up this time, the way they had not fully caught up all the times before. They caught up. The Prince George's County Police Department's fugitive unit, the same specialized component of the department that exists specifically to track and apprehend people who flee from criminal charges, got on it immediately. Critical assistance came from the Metro Transit Police Department, which provided surveillance footage from its cameras. That footage allowed detectives to track Lindsey's movements after he fled Stretford Way, to follow his path through the surveillance grid that modern urban infrastructure creates to build a picture of where he had gone and where he was likely going. By Sunday morning, on a less than 24 hours after Sharita was pronounced dead at the scene, the fugitive unit had located Harry Lindsey in Capitol Heights, Maryland. He was arrested. He was taken into custody. He was charged with first and second-degree murder. He was placed in the Department of Corrections on no bond status. No ankle bracelet this time. No home detention. No promise that the device on his leg would be sufficient. No second opportunity to demonstrate what happened when the system chose monitoring over incarceration. He was inside a cell, and this time, the prosecution would not be asking a judge whether that was appropriate. The charge was murder. The choice had been made for everyone. The arrest was a fast et, and it was certain, and it came with the weight of the evidence that had been building since June 16th, and arguably for years before that. The surveillance footage from Metro Transit, the prior arrest record, the lethality assessment was dated weeks earlier. His own acknowledgement, later given to the Washington Post, that he was the one who shot her. The case against Harry Lindsey did not need to be built from scratch. The system had been building it, document by document, incident by incident, for as long as this relationship had been on law enforcement's radar. What the system had not done was act on what it was building in time to stop the death that all of that documentation had been warning about. Prince George's County Executive Aisha Braveboy held a press conference on July 8th, 3 days after Sharita's death. She stood at a podium and said the things that a county executive says at a press conference about a preventable homicide, but she said them with a specificity and a directness that press conference language rarely achieves. She said the homicide should never have happened. She said the man who strangled Sharita should have been held without bond. She said she could not explain why the decision to release him on home monitoring had been made, and she was explicit that it should not have been made. She cited the research on strangulation, the 7 times more likely to be killed statistic, the felony elevation that Maryland had passed in 2020, specifically because that statistic is that damning, and she connected it directly to what had just happened to a 29-year-old woman in Landover. Anyone who strangles you intends to kill you. Make no mistake. Those were her words delivered days after the woman whose strangulation she was referencing was already in the ground. Braveboy's directness at that press conference did something important. It put on the public record, from the highest elected official in Prince George's County government, an acknowledgement that the system had failed. Not a hedge, not a deflection, an acknowledgement. She said it should not have happened. She said the decision was wrong. She did not hide behind the independence of the judicia or the complexity of bond hearings or the procedural constraints that public officials sometimes use to create distance between themselves and institutional failures. She stood there and said the truth, which was that a woman was dead because a judge had made a call that the evidence did not support, and that the county executive of Prince George's County was standing at a podium, unable to explain why. That accountability matters. It matters for the record. It matters for the families of Sharita Cristwell, who were sitting in the front rows of that press conference listening to a government official confirm what they already knew in their bones, which was that the system had looked at the danger their daughter was in and decided it was not urgent enough. It matters for every woman in Prince George's County who is currently in a relationship with a man who has put his hands on her, who is navigating the decision of whether to report, whether to press charges, whether to trust that the machinery of the justice system will protect her if she does. What she saw at that press conference was a county executive confirming that the machinery had failed, and that acknowledgement, however painful, is more honest and more useful than the alternative, which is the official silence that usually follows these deaths. The family of Sharita Cristwell gave their grief to the public in the specific, generous, heartbreaking way that families sometimes do when they understand that the only thing that can come from their loss that has any value is awareness. Kim Cristwell, Sharita's sister, stood at the press conference and spoke through tears. She said her little sister had tried to get away, but it was not in time. She said domestic violence is serious. She said do not let anyone put their hands on you, no matter who they are. Do not give them chances. Do not believe what they say. They will manipulate you. Just find a way to get out. She was not speaking in abstractions. She was speaking from the specific, shattering experience of a woman who had just lost her baby sister to a man who had been telling her family he was sorry while the ankle monitor blinked on his leg and the lethality assessment sat in a court file classified as high danger. Those words came from the deepest possible place of knowing, and they deserve to be heard by every person who is currently in a situation that looks anything like what Sharita was in. Grace McCotter, Sharita's mother, also spoke. She said the words that became the sentence everyone heard, the words that crystallized the entire failure of this case into a single devastating sequence. She told the press conference how Lindsey had called her after the June 16th strangulation. Akron, how he had said he was sorry, how he had said he loved her daughter and would never do it again, how she had told him not to sit on the phone and say he loved her daughter if he did not mean it, how she had warned him directly that if he put his hands on her daughter again, there would be a problem, how he had responded with apology and promises. And then she said what came after that. He killed my baby. 4 days later, he killed my baby. The precision of those words, the way they carry the entire arc from the phone call to the death in a single sentence, is the most concentrated expression of what this case is and what it costs that exists anywhere in the public record. The community response that followed Sharita's death had the quality of grief that recognizes a pattern. This was not shock in the sense of something no one saw coming. The people who wrote and organized and showed up in the days after July 5th were responding to a death that felt familiar in the worst possible way. Familiar as the end of a story they had seen before. Familiar as the name that gets added to a list that is already too long. Kim organized a balloon release for July 12th, a week after her sister's death. She called Sharita by her nickname, Gorgeous Heather, and asked people to keep the whole family in their prayers. The community's response to the GoFundMe organized in Sharita's memory reflected both genuine love for a woman many people knew and the urgent practical reality of 2 daughters who now had funeral costs to cover and a future to fund without a mother to provide for them. More than $6,000 raised in days. When Harmony and Layla had lost their mother and the community was trying to fill some fraction of that gap with money that could not fill it, but that said, we see you and we have not walked away. Juanica Fisher, a community voice, wrote that domestic violence continues to plague communities and offered condolences to the Cristwell family. Chantel Love Shani James wrote something that cuts deeper, something that reflects the accumulated frustration of a community that has been watching the justice system under-respond to domestic violence for years. She wrote that Prince George's County had failed Sharita Cristwell, that she had told police, prosecutors, and judges for years that the law does not take domestic violence seriously until it ends in a fatality. Those words are not hyperbole, and they are the testimony of someone who has been paying attention, who has watched the pattern, who has seen women report abuse and seen the system process those reports without the urgency that the pattern demands, who has observed the gap between what the law says it does and what the law actually does when the victim is a Black woman in a county that, despite all its progress, still has 15 domestic-related homicides in a single year. That number, 15 domestic-related homicides in Prince George's County in 2025, is the number that the celebration of reduced overall crime rates cannot fully absorb. Overall homicides were down more than 30% that year in the county, a genuine public safety achievement that reflected real work by law enforcement and real changes in community conditions. But the domestic violence number told a different story. Domestic violence incidents were down only 2% from the prior year, and at least 15 women or people in intimate partner situations did not make it through the year alive. Sharita Cristwell was one of 15. That is not a rounding error. That is a sustained, specific failure in a particular category of violence. The category that disproportionately kills Black women, the category where the warning signs are most often documented before the death occurs, the category where the court system's decisions about detention and monitoring have the most direct and measurable impact on whether a person lives or dies. Harry Lindsey sat in custody and told the Washington Post he acted in self-defense. He denied the relationship had ended. He denied abusing Sharita. He sat in a cell charged with her murder, and his story was that he was the victim of the encounter. This is the psychology of intimate partner violence perpetrators documented across thousands of cases. The absolute inability to locate themselves as the originating cause of violence, the reframing of control as love and aggression as protection, the sincere belief, or at least the stated belief, that the person they murdered somehow brought it on themselves. Lindsey's self-defense claim was not an aberration from who he had been throughout this relationship. It was a continuation of it. The surveillance video of Sharita's car was him monitoring what he believed was rightfully his to monitor. The death threat was him expressing what he believed was a legitimate grievance. The strangulation was, in his telling, something other than what the marks on her neck documented it as. And the shooting was, in his telling, protection. Every act of violence reframed as a response. Every aggression reframed as a reaction. The entire pattern of behavior towards Sharita Cristwell organized, in his account, around his own victimhood. The prosecution was not interested in his account. The evidence was not organized around his account. The prior arrest record, the lethality assessment, the surveillance threat, the strangulation charge, the ankle monitor data placing him at the scene of the murder, his own admission to the Washington Post that he was the one who pulled the trigger. These were not a story about self-defense. They were a story about a man who had been told repeatedly and formally that his behavior was criminal and dangerous, who had been given every benefit of the doubt the system offers, including a release that the prosecution had specifically argued against, and who had used that release to do exactly what the lethality assessment said he might do. He is charged with first-degree murder. He is in the Department of Corrections without bond. The case is working its way through the Prince George's County court system. Whatever verdict ultimately comes, whatever sentence a judge imposes on Harry Dominique Lindsey, it will arrive in a courtroom where the record is complete and damning and impossible to reframe as anything other than what it is. A woman reported being strangled. The system classified her as high danger. The court released the man who strangled her. 19 days later, he shot her twice and left her body in an apartment on the 4th of July weekend, while her daughters were somewhere in the world not yet knowing what had just happened to their mother. Harmony and Layla Lindsey turned 9 and 10 years old after their mother was gone. Their birthdays were only a day apart, two little girls born close enough in time that their celebrations had always overlapped, always felt like one extended shared moment of being loved and seen and celebrated by a mother who poured into them. They celebrated those birthdays at a skating rink, without their mother, without their father who was in custody charged with killing her, surrounded by the grandmothers who were now in a legal dispute over who would raise them. Joyce Cristwell, Sharita's adopted mother, had recently secured a 4-bedroom home, Ottawa, the exact dream Sharita had described to her. Enough rooms for everyone. Joyce told the landlord what had happened to her daughter. He told her the house was hers. It is the kind of grace that appears sometimes in the aftermath of catastrophic loss, a stranger extending something real and tangible in the direction of a family that is trying to hold itself together in the shape of a woman who is no longer there to hold it. That 4-bedroom house will never be what Sharita imagined it, but it will hold her daughters and her mother and the memory of what she was building toward. And that matters even when it also aches. The custody dispute between the grandmothers speaks to another dimension of what Harry Lindsey's choice on July 5th produced. He did not just kill Sharita, he orphaned Harmony and Layla. He removed both parents from 2 children in a single afternoon, himself through the act of murder and the subsequent incarceration, Sharita through death. Those girls are now the subject of a legal proceeding about who gets to raise them, who gets to be the adult presence they wake up to and fall asleep under the care of, who gets to be the person they call when something happens at school or when they are sick or when they need to be reminded that they are loved. The family that was supposed to surround them, that had surrounded them, that Sharita had been building into something stable and warm and big enough to hold everyone, was fractured by a man who could not accept that a woman he had spent a decade with had decided her future looked different from what he wanted. The story of what this means for Black women in America, one specifically, is one that the data has been telling for a long time and that cases like Sharita's make impossible to look away from. Black women are disproportionately represented in domestic violence homicide statistics. They are more likely to be killed by intimate partners than women of other racial groups. They are less likely to receive the level of institutional response that their reported abuse warrants. Their cases move through the justice system in ways that reflect, in aggregate, a devaluation of their safety that is documented and persistent, and that activists and researchers have been naming and challenging for decades without the systemic change that naming and challenging should produce. Sharita Cristwell's case is not simply a domestic violence case that happened to involve a black woman. Only it is a domestic violence case whose specific failure points, the lethality assessment that was ignored, the prosecution's request that was denied, the release on an ankle bracelet instead of detention, are legible in the context of how black women's safety is weighted by institutions that still, in 2025, routinely make choices that cost black women their lives. That is not a comfortable statement. It is not a comfortable reality. But it is the reality that Grace McCotter was living when she stood at that press conference and said, "He killed my baby." It is the reality that Kim Cristwell was speaking into when she said her sister tried to get away, but it was not in time. It is the reality that Aisha Braveboy was acknowledging. With the particular weight of a black woman who had spent her career in the justice system, when she stood at that podium and said this homicide should never have happened and could not explain why it did. All three of those women were standing inside the same reality, the reality of a system that had every tool it needed to protect Sharita Cristwell and made a choice that cost her life, and they were demanding, in the specific language of grief and accountability, that the community see it clearly and not look away. The case of Sharita Cristwell and Harry Lindsey is not over. The legal proceedings are ongoing. Harry Lindsey is in custody, charged with first-degree murder, and the Prince George's County judicial system will eventually bring this case to trial in a courtroom where the evidence will be laid out and a jury will be asked to reach a verdict. What that verdict will be, when it will come, what sentence will follow, these are questions that the legal calendar has not yet answered. But the facts of what happened before July 5th, 2025 are already fully documented. The strangulation is documented. The lethality assessment is documented. The prosecution's request for detention is documented. The release is documented. The 19 days between the strangulation and the murder are documented. And what the community of Prince George's County and the family of Sharita Cristwell and every person paying attention to this case is waiting for is for the legal system that failed her in June to do in that courtroom what it should have done before she died, which is to look at the full weight of Harry Lindsey's conduct and decide, with the force of law and the permanence of a verdict, what it is worth. Sharita Cristwell deserved that accountability while she was alive. She deserved the system to look at her lethality assessment and say high danger means high danger, not high danger pending a better offer. She deserved to be the woman who moved on, who found what her sister called real love, who built the 4-bedroom house with enough rooms for everyone, who watched Harmony and Layla grow up and graduate and become the women their mother was already proud of them for becoming. She deserved all of it. The system had the tools to give her a chance at it. It chose otherwise. And what we owe her now, beyond the verdict, beyond the sentence, beyond the GoFundMe and the balloon release, and the press conference with its tears and its accountability, is the sustained, an unrelenting insistence that the choice that was made in her case never be made again. That is the demand her death makes on every institution that touched it, on every judge who holds a bond hearing where a lethality assessment sits in the file, on every county executive who pushes for felony strangulation laws and then watches those laws be under-enforced in her own jurisdiction, on every community member who knows someone in a situation that looks like what Sharita described and has not yet said out loud that this is serious, that this is high danger, that when he tells you he is going to kill you, he means it. On every person watching this right now who has minimized something they saw or heard because the alternative, taking it seriously, taking it to the level that the evidence demands, he feels too heavy or too complicated or too uncertain. Sharita Cristwell's mother took it seriously. She told Harry Lindsey to his face that if he put his hands on her daughter again, there would be a problem. He heard her. He said sorry. He said he loved her daughter. He said he would never do it again. And then he did the worst version of it 4 days later, with a gun, in the middle of a Saturday afternoon. The phone call and the murder were not separate events connected by coincidence. They were the same event, continuous and unbroken. The apology and the killing existing inside the same psychology, the same pattern. the same refusal to accept that Sharita Cristwell had the right to choose her own life, her own love, her own future, without his permission and without his violence serving as the final word. Her sister Kim called her Gorgeous Heather. That nickname, personal and warm and specific to the people who knew her best, is the thing about Sharita Cristwell that resists reduction. The lethality assessment has a case number. The murder charge has a docket. The GoFundMe has a dollar figure. But Gorgeous Heather is just a woman with a gift for making people beautiful who showed up to her mother's house with a smile and had a whole life ahead of her and daughters who needed her and a dream about a house big enough for everyone. That is who was in that apartment on July 5th. That is who the ankle monitor failed to protect. That is who Prince George's County lost because a judge made a call that the evidence said was wrong. Her name was Sharita Cristwell. She was 29 years old. She was somebody's baby, and she deserved to live. If this story hit you the way it should, if it made you feel something, if it made you angry or sad or both at the same time, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Behind the Evidence if you have not already. Every story we tell is told because it matters, because the people in it deserve more than a moment of news coverage and then silence, and because silence is exactly what these cases count on to keep repeating. We are not going to be silent, and neither should you.